Good evening, El Paso. Welcome to another episode of Philosophic Dialogues from La Frontera, where we have fun asking the big questions with you. My name is Dr. Kim Diaz, and I teach philosophy here at EPCC.
And my name is Jules Simon. I'm a philosopher and teach and work at UTEP, University of Texas, El Paso.
And today's episode will compare and contrast the similarities between philosophy and religion. So we're very honored to have Father Bob Mosher joining us today. He is a Catholic priest who left New England for Chile in 1980 as a member of the Mission Society of St. Columban, and spent the next 30 years serving in parishes in the capital city, Santiago, in working class neighborhoods known as poblaciónes. 10 of those years were during the Pinochet dictatorship, when the Catholic Church sheltered and supported the victims of human rights abuses through the Vicariate of Solidarity. I hope I pronounced that correctly. In 2011, Father Bob arrived to work in El Paso at the Columban Mission Center, where he coordinated the border awareness experience for visiting groups with the close collaboration of Annunciation House, El Paso's older shelter for migrants. Returning to New England in 2020, Father Bob now resides in Bristol, Rhode Island. So thank you so much for taking the time to join us today, Father Mosher.
You're welcome.
All right, so we'll go ahead and get started. It's a very small question, but I'm sure it has well, we'll see. What is religion?
Religion, I think the etymology of the word helps us to understand what religion is in a helpful way. That comes from the Latin religare, to reconnect or link up again, based on the universal experience of disconnection with a source of peace and joy, liberation, fulfillment that people have felt themselves lacking from the very beginnings of civilization. Material needs being met for people, there's always a deep dissatisfaction and discontentment with life, accompanied by a sense of something's missing, which moves us as human beings to perform rituals and ingest substances sometimes that seem to reconnect us to a source of happiness, peace, joy, liberation, if only for a brief time. For me, Clifford Geertz's writings get close, I think, to the heart of what we understand as a religious experience, in that sense, that spiritual and religious traditions and practices and teachings seem to provide generation after generation and improve the experience of linking up with a source of joy and peace, which eases the sense of alienation from the source of contentment, peace, and support that is found in every culture. So there's a desire to draw near to the source that is very strong in human society. And religion is an organized way of providing something like a religious experience through the performance of certain rituals and providing certain kinds of ambience in which a reconnection to the source of what is missing is provided.
I have a follow-up question to the one I just asked. Why do we humans forget that connection? Because it's always right there, but we forget, or we disconnect. Why do we disconnect, or why do you think humans forget about that connection?
Well, it seems to be a universally human experience. We have religious explanations, but like the whole story about Adam and Eve is an attempt to explain why things seem so out of whack for human beings coming into the world that they have to search and struggle for some sense of peace and joy in their lives. And making mistakes and taking the wrong turns and coming to dead ends is something of a universal human experience as well. It's what we would call in religious terms an unredeemed state that for Christians made it necessary for God to become one of us in Jesus of Nazareth and to experience what it is to be human so as to redeem the human experience and the human person to a state of reconciliation with the source of all life, the Creator, and to become even co-workers with this Creator in the coming of a new and reconciled reality that Jesus called in the terms of his own people, the kingdom of God. So that's a kind of a theological answer. So it sounds like a rather negative anthropological understanding, a concept of the human being as not so much essentially flawed, but as in a state of alienation from that which he or she has to struggle to find again. And many other religions feel that they have the basis to announce that they provide this sense of liberation and peace and joy for their adherents as well. I think another thing about religion is that it's organized. It often has a hierarchy of authorities and a body of written doctrines and revelatory scriptures, whereas spiritual experiences are more extensive and often, for instance, from the Christian point of view, we call Hinduism or Buddhism as spiritual traditions rather than religions, because they're less structured than religious organizations in other parts of the world, in other cultures in the West, we may say. But why this exists? It does exist. And I've always found it kind of fascinating that the need is there, whether it's religion that is approached to satisfy that need, or philosophy itself, and the humanitarian philosophies and practices also help to assuage, I think, this existential dread that is difficult to bear for many people.
I appreciate that you turn the dialogue over towards Christian approach, especially you're coming from your own tradition there, right? And as you know, Kim and I are both philosophers, so we study religion. I've been studying religion a long time. Kim just recently is studying especially monotheistic religions in a course she's developing. But right now I'm reading this book for a class I'm teaching called Love and St. Augustine. So it's by Hannah Arendt. Yeah, I'm sure you've heard her name, and I'm sure you know.
She's a favorite of mine, yes.
She's a favorite.
She helped me, just parenthetically, she helped me understand a lot of what was going on during the dictatorship in Chile because of her work with totalitarian philosophies and regimes.
That's a wonderful work. It's quite relevant, pertinent, especially to understanding why dictatorships happen and where they come from. And so what interested me, though, in your response to Kim's initial question was your reference, and I'm thinking exactly of this particular book I'm reading by Arendt, Love and St. Augustine, which was her dissertation, that she wrote under the influence of Heidegger and Jaspers and kind of existential concerns, right? But one of the responses one of the threads that she picks up is, what is the source that we come from and that we return to, right? So what is that source? And so that plays out throughout the book, and she uses her philosophical analyses of Augustine's works, especially the Confessions and the City of God and the Trinity and also on choice of the free will, to explore the Christian, specifically Christian way of understanding that return to the origin, right? And so I could almost hear some of Augustine's, Augustine's responses to that because of the huge philosophical influence that his own studies in religion, how they had, what the effect that they had on his religious belief, right? His kind of philosophical background, the way he went around it. And he precisely gets to, she at least identifies this, and I think it's clearly there in Augustine's work. She gets to that point that you got to towards the end of your comments about isolation and alienation. One of the reasons why we go back to that source is precisely to deal with our identities as human beings and how we get isolated from each other, right? Some of these comments I made, why is it important to study religion? And not just religion in general, but why for you was it important to study Christian religion?
Well, like Augustine, if I may be so bold, I think it was an experience that preceded that interest in religion as an academic or researchable topic. It became fascinating for me because it helped me understand my own personal experience, like Augustine's, of finally finding something and experiencing as an outpouring of love for me as a person from the very source that I was looking for in my own personal life, a source that cleared up a lot of things. It came at a time when, during my second year in college, when I was growing anxious about what career I would choose and how I would live my life. And I think afterwards I recognized that there were expectations of me from family, friends, and society that I start deciding what the rest of my life is going to be about. So it brings a smile to my lips now, of course, because it's, I don't think I recognized it as operating at the time, but it's a way society has, I think, perhaps we're getting close to Noam Chomsky now, a way society has of controlling its more rebellious part of society into acceptable roles and activities, rather than allowing for a full-scale explosion of rebellion and or revolution in society, almost as if our educational system, as Chomsky often writes, was putting that pressure on us not to choose a form of life that might be too dangerous for society to handle. So it became an interesting topic for me, to return to your question, because it came after my religious experience and helped me to understand, by studying writers such as St. Augustine and Thomas Merton, who has used the phrase existential dread in several of his writings, to understand in modern terms what was happening to my life and why I was deciding on the basis of my religious experience to choose a profession that really doesn't make much sense in the secular world. It certainly didn't make much sense to my own family and parents, but that was part of the excitement of choosing something rather daring that would differentiate me from the previous generation within my own family.
Just to follow this line a little bit, thinking of Thomas Merton's Seven-Story Mountain, right?
Yes.
Were you influenced as he was to follow a kind of Trappist or monastic sort of profession? Part of your life path was, eventually to go to Chile and serve in the face of dictatorship. So you didn't kind of squirrel away, so to speak, in a monastery, praying for the salvation of humankind, but you actually kind of engaged in a very volatile way, right? I mean, what's the paths that we, the kind of choices we make and which path to pursue? Yours led to a much more Christian engaged as opposed to a Christian reflective, contemplative one, right?
Yes, there's a lot going on in such choices and experience psychologically, background, personal capacities and gifts being met. I think yeah, it was different from the very beginning. In fact, even preceding the religious experience, I was already fantasizing with the possibility of becoming a priest in a third world country. The Civil War in Biafra was going on at the time in 1971, 72, when I was in my second year of college and just kind of thinking about the possibility of working overseas away from the materialism and all the things that I was critical about in the early 70s, coming out of the heritage handed on to us by those who were teenagers in the 1960s, of course. I was still very much in the throes of that questioning of everything. And so rejecting a comfortable material existence was rather important to me at the time. And I still tried to live that ideal, of course, but it was really passionate for me that I not become a priest in the United States. The priest in the States I perceived as having it too good, too comfortable. There were priests who would buy a new car every year. And as a person in their 20s, that kind of created a distaste in me for any job or career that would act in such a contradictory way to gospel values. So from the very beginning, I did want to get out of the country. And there was a lot of anger in me that found a lot of sympathy for the movements of the 1960s, in which I was, of course, at the time too young to join in. Seemed like the revolution was over by the time I became a teenager. But the anger tended to express itself in indignation and absolute revulsion at the way people were treated by their own governments and dictatorships in other countries. In a way, what's happening now in our own country is like full circle for me. It was almost as if I experienced in Chile at the time something that we're in danger of falling into now in my own country. And I feel rather prepared for it, since in Chile I could see the importance of acting in solidarity with many sectors of society to address the moral earthquake that an authoritarian regime represented for the people of Chile. I think I'm digressing, though.
Well, this is all very, very good. Jules mentioned, I hope we make it past the first question because
I know. It's just like
there's so much, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, let me bring it back to our questions, which was, what do you think are the differences between religion and philosophy? So what are the differences and the similarities? Because obviously they're different, but they're also very similar.
There's certainly a search for truth behind both of them. I think what is true, what is real, which is why philosophy is such a service to us who are in religious organizations. It gives us the tools to not only to understand better what we're all about, but also how to dialogue with the world and to feel the companionship of others who search for truth but are nowhere near our own options, lifestyles, or perspective upon reality. It helps us. It helps us to consider existential philosophy, and it's provided for us in our training. So philosophy is like a tool, provides us with the tools that we can use in order to talk about what is vitally important to us to talk about and to share with others, with an attitude of forcing people to wake up it's not a form of proselytizing, but a form of dialogue that listens to the other and discovers things in common. But of course, philosophy and religion have their own boundaries too, and these, I think, should be respected. Philosophy kind of betrays itself if it is based on any particular non-empirical beliefs, perhaps. I'm not too sure about that, but there are proper boundaries, I think, and it's a great service to us to see people arrive at the truth without feeling the need for revelatory sources. Yeah, a need for precision in language, the search for truth, the openness to human values, I think, too. I think there have been philosophers who find humanitarianism as an important element of living the truth.
Now I wanted to ask your take on the difference between religion and spirituality.
Well, that's a little easier. The religion is like an organized form of spirituality, spiritual practices and traditions. As I mentioned, there's often a hierarchy of authority that determines the content of doctrine for religion, whereas spiritual experiences or spiritual traditions can be something, from the Western point of view, less structured, less organized, and more deeply rooted in cultural practices and experiences that lie at the heart of the cultural traditions of peoples, identified very much with particular cultures.
Do you want to ask the next question?
I do.
Okay.
So the next one is it possible to be an ethical person without belief in God? But I want to say something before you address that question. Is it possible to be ethical without belief in God? I mentioned I was studying using Arendt's dissertation work on love and St. Augustine. For the course I'm teaching on her work, we're focusing on her overall body of work. And one of the reasons I chose it was because very early on in my undergraduate years, I got influenced by Augustine. I had a philosophy professor, did a whole course on Augustine, and we read all of his work. Well, City of God and Choice of the Free Will and Confessions, all these works that Arendt draws on. One of the distinctions she makes in that work comes from the way she uses the City of God for her understanding of why humans do what we do in the first place in society and with each other. That is, why do we love our neighbors, right? Which is the central tenet, one of the central tenets in Christianity, right? Love your neighbor as yourself, right? And so I think my earlier question about Thomas Merton and the monastic path versus your path, which took you to Chile, under the Columban connection, right? Has to do with something like that. And the one is a path of spiritual sort of, the way I understand it is a kind of spiritual sort of journey that's really important for one's self-identity and self-discovery. But the other path is rooted in a much more kind of empirical-based historical response. Entering into the politics of what's going on in a developing country. And so it seems like you followed that one. You took history very seriously, in your own sort of spiritual path. Am I right in that, characterizing it that way?
I wonder. It's a good question. It makes me think. But there's a lot more of the spiritual in that sort of decision than perhaps you're implying. I basically identify very closely with Augustine's own experience of God as being so similar to my own. And yet we have to remember that in Latin America, especially in Chile, the groundwork had already been laid for religious criticism of oppressive regimes. That's especially in times of great repression, when the universities and the colleges throughout the country, Catholic and non-Catholic, each had a general assigned as rector in order to control the kinds of things that were thought about and debated in the intellectual centers of Chile. The religious institution saw itself as having a role in conflictive situations, and the theology of liberation fit into that perspective very nicely, a work that had already begun to take place in the 1960s with the publication of Gustavo Gutierrez, the theology of liberation. The only kind of theology worth doing, it was felt at the time in Latin America in general, was the theology that came out of the experience of accompanying the oppressed as they became protagonists of their own future and struggled for the liberation of the poor in every sense. There were certain elements in Christian theology that supported that conflictive and side-taking role for believers, for Christians, that permitted and encouraged us to take sides and to see things from the perspective of the oppressed, of which there were plenty in Latin America in the 1980s. My own personal option to leave the United States and work someplace overseas because poverty gave a lot for religious people to do, fit in very nicely to a further development that actually any Christian is called to take the side of the oppressed where there exists a political situation like that of Nazi Germany. Dietrich Bonhoeffer comes to mind, and throughout Latin America, ironically, under regimes that were imposed by the United States government on the continent at the time. So there was, I guess to answer your question, there's more of a spiritual basis for political commitments to the liberation of the poor that might be implied by.
Yeah, I didn't mean to make such a strong bifurcation because I think at least Arendt's analysis of Augustine there is that the both are kind of necessary. And there's just these two ways that have importance both for each other. You know, the search for self-identity and individual redemption and salvation has to go somehow hand in hand with some kind of duty or concern or love for your neighbor that takes a kind of political form or historical form. It's just that you can emphasize one over the other, and it seems like you emphasized that one. And as you were talking, by the way, lots of I was also came into my graduate studies through Christian theology and philosophy of religion, and so I'm hearing in your words this kind of formula that I learned at that time, which echoes what you were saying. It's the preferential treatment of the poor, which the liberation theologians took up as their kind of battle cry, or something like that. So, yeah, I'm very familiar with that kind of political theological terrain.
The beauty of it is that when it's correctly understood and I dare say practiced, the liberation theology depends upon that intensely personal experience of a relationship, a working relationship, I might emphasize, with the source of life, peace, and personal liberation as well.
Yeah.
I mention that because often liberation theology is put down as the mere influence on Marxism on the theology of a progressive sector of the church. And there were plenty of conservative Catholics and authorities who tried to put down liberation theology in that way. But at its heart, it is a faithful expression of the beliefs of Christianity and of the gospel that was announced by Jesus of Nazareth. And it had such great support throughout the centuries. In the 2,000 years of Christianity, just to mention St. Teresa of Avila, there was a constant emphasis and profundization, a deepening of understanding of what it means to have a relationship with God and to love your neighbor at the same time. St. Teresa made a very interesting discovery that it's in loving our neighbor, in our attempt to accompany our neighbor in the difficult times of his or her life, that we come to discover that we love God, that we really have no idea what loving God means until we begin to discover how God sustains us to love our neighbor, which can be very difficult most times, in fact, to have the kind of patience you need to listen to an elderly person, or to stand and march in the streets in front of a torture center in Santiago for five minutes before the police could show up. It provides the experience that this is a crazy thing to do, but it seems like God is supporting me and not allowing me to be a prisoner of my fears. And kind of, who is this person and what have you done with the old person sort of realization that at its heart allows us to love God, because God is patient with us and provides us opportunities that we can handle, but we can also grow into even more demanding situations of love of neighbor because he loves us that much, so as to help us pragmatically with our own struggles, with our own cowardice and sometimes overpowering need for self-preservation.
Thank you for such a beautiful response. That was wonderful. Yeah.
Well, I in my take of it, my question wasn't answered, so I'm gonna ask again. If you answered it, it totally went over my head. So the question was, is it possible to be an ethical person without believing God?
Yeah, it seems to be, just observing how well atheists, agnostics, and believers work together to defend human rights in Chile. It certainly does seem less important to believe in God than to feel the deep interior pull of our conscience to help our neighbor, especially our neighbor that is most vulnerable. We had so much common ground. I often found myself saying to my friends quietly in the midst of the troubles in Chile, some of these members of the Communist Party that come to our poblaciónes to attend to the wounded in our chapels, they seem to have more faith than many of our more traditional Catholics. And there was a profound sense in which that is true. There's a faith that unites, well, that lays the groundwork for cooperation, the kind of faith that is a faith in the capacity of the human being to do good and to create a government and a society that puts the vulnerable in the first place. It's a kind of faith. It's a kind of belief, even if it's only expressed in a rather militaristic way as giving of ourselves for future generations, which a lot of my communist friends warm to. They like that kind of motivating perspective, that the suffering I put up with now in opposing the Pinochet regime will provide a better future for my children and grandchildren. But there's a kind of faith there, not an explicit declaration of belief in God of any kind, but a certain statement, position, perspective that says it's important to look beyond the present reality and to hope in a future that will bring justice and peace to the world. It's a kind of a faith too. I don't think I ever met anyone without any faith in my years in Chile. And I may add, in El Paso, as there was a similar coming together on the theme of migrants' rights during my 10 years in El Paso, I found this kind of faith in the democratic socialists and others with whom we teamed up in order to promote human rights activities and support for people in detention who were migrants, or even in ecological justice. The Green New Deal, I think, finds many believers participating in its tenets and close to those who express no particular faith in any religious entity, but listen to their conscience and realize what we are called to do as human beings deep within our perception of good and evil.
I'm enjoying this dialogue very much. Thank you again.
Me too.
You know, the reference to the New Green Deal, that's the
Or Green New Deal.
Green New Deal, the Green New Deal, the Green New Deal, because of the reference to the earlier New Deal, right? Again, reminds me of this origin issue that you first brought up and that I reiterated, and has to do also with this question that Kim's, insistence on is can you be ethical if you're not if you don't believe in God, right? So one of the ways to navigate that is that, well, let's look at the source. Where do we come from? We all come from the earth in some way, And again, you did refer to the story of Adam and Eve as one of those origin stories. Like we all come from human ancestors. And those human ancestors come from earlier human ancestors all the way back to, very old human ancestors, right? But we have this kind of common source, right, that we can join hands in understanding and studying. That also has to do with the common source of the earth, the earth as a good created thing from a Christian perspective, right? So you want to take care of creation by taking care of these fellow human beings as well, right? And am I off base here, or?
Yeah, it's all of the piece. Pope Francis wrote his encyclical on the human relationship with its natural home.
Oh, nice. Yeah.
Years ago, Laudato Si, and with a very holistic perspective in that sense, and based on the whole presumption that we can work together, and we will have to work together in order to address climate change and the damaging effects of our lifestyle and economic policies and all the fruits of the Enlightenment, so to speak, and the Industrial Revolution. We will have to come together on that. Those who believe in God and those who don't, we find it equally imperative, whatever we believe, to address the damage that has been done and is continuing to be done by our exploitation of our natural home and our treating of our natural home as an object, unrelated to us, rather than as a member of our cosmic family, if you will, related to us, so that what we do to the environment actually does have an effect on our own lives.
Yeah, and this is related to this next question about the church and state, What do you think about that relationship? Because it played itself out in your life you embodied that conflict or that relationship in very real ways, right? You're working for the church, right? Your commitment is to that way of life. In the face of the political realities, right, of the church not getting along with the state in many ways, right, and vice versa, because the church is really critical, right?
Yeah, there's a role. It's kind of fascinating to have been a part of that, because as as someone brought up in the US, I think it's been a very good arrangement to keep any particular church or religious organization from linking itself to the resources of the state. Many Catholics believe that was a big mistake we made when we yielded to the temptation to accept Constantine's support for our church. It produced many contradictions. And so we're glad, we in the US at least, and in many other countries generally, are glad to be rid of that contradiction of being supported by the state while the state does some very unchristian things. And we just kind of go along with it because of that linking and the benefits of that sort of relationship. We're better off without it. And that's my own deeply held conviction too, because I was brought up in that kind of perspective in the United States. And then I go to Chile and I see the advantages immediately of identifying yourself with the church in the field of human rights. And many communists and socialists and supposed atheists also saw the need to, practically speaking, get under that umbrella because things are going to get really rough. And so in a practical sense, all of us, even progressives within the Catholic Church, suddenly found ourselves very Catholic in what we did and finding the protection in that, which does work in a sort of feudal state. The whole setup in Latin America and other parts of the world is of another paradigm, the paradigm, in fact, that St. Augustine saw coming in and justified to a great extent with his work on the city of God. But it's a paradigm that ended centuries ago in much of Europe and in the United States, and has not ended in the traditionally Catholic countries. We were able to use that contradiction, that anachronism, very well and very intelligently, I think, to keep our offices and people from being repressed during the military regime, which after all had boasted that they had thrown the atheist Marxists out of the country and were saving the Christian identity of Chile. But to find the cardinal refusing to shake the hand of the dictator or to shut down the Vicariate of Solidarity, which had offices in every single city in the country of Chile, to attend to the needs of those who were looking for their disappeared relatives, etc. That Catholic identity worked very well. It's as if, in normal times, we don't want that privileged position, but in times of trouble, it does give us an edge.
Yeah, in times when that original sin just becomes dominating and totalitarian.
producing a sort of moral earthquake. I remember being very impressed by one of the bishops in Chile who were very united about this. There were about 28 bishops in Chile at the time, and they all supported having the human rights offices in their own diocesan buildings. And one of them, interviewed by an officialist newspaper, said that in times of an earthquake, you don't ask what people believe before you accept their help in removing pieces of walls and looking for survivors. And it's like that in times of a moral earthquake as well, such as the authoritarian regime that was imposed on Chileans. You don't start selecting people who only believe the things you believe before you accept their help in the defense of basic human rights.
My next question has to do with whether we humans can be objective, because we have a tendency to want to be objective. Like in ethics, right, we say we shouldn't give preference to anyone, otherwise it's nepotism, right? So everybody counts the same, and that's a way to have justice, right? Fairness. So that's the impetus of the question, but I'm wondering about what you think if someone who, I'll read it, for someone who is involved in politics, for instance, a judge or a governor, is it possible for them to actually separate their religious beliefs from their politics? Can they truly be objective?
Yeah, deep question. I don't know if I can answer that because I'm not sure there is really a possibility of becoming completely objective about things. I tend to embrace identity as giving us the freedom to see the truth of situations, especially in a cultural identity sort of sense. I don't know if this is the best way to get at your question, but I will tell you that my studies in journalism have led me to think that it's wiser just to acknowledge your prejudices and your particular way of looking at things, rather than to struggle to attain some state of complete objectivity. Better to recognize perhaps your own prejudices and tendencies to obfuscate the truth that is uncomfortable, but to try to achieve some state of objectivity, at least in the field of journalism, for me is just not possible and not very valuable either. I guess through my experience in Chile and other places, I think it's more important to take a side, the side of the vulnerable, and not be objective or think that truth always lies in the middle. Between the extremes of good and evil, I don't think it's right to say, well, I'm just going to be objective about this and present the truth as if it lay somewhere between the two. The truth that is in harmony with our deeply held human conviction that we have to be loving and compassionate in practice and in outlook. That's a fundamental truth that is more important than thinking that we have to get at something that will only lead perhaps to a toleration of the evil situation or an indifference toward it. That can allow great evils to take place. Perhaps something like that can be said of many intellectuals in Germany during the time of the rise of the Nazi regime, where there were lots of interesting phenomena and experiments performed in the name of searching for truth, but a terrible disengagement of the human conscience from those sorts of activities. So that you could, for me, it's always been rather mysterious how evil can take the form of activities of smart people, intellectually gifted people who design a better gas to be used in the extermination camps of Nazi Germany, so that the Nazi army, well, the German army, wouldn't have to use so many bullets on eliminating the Jewish race. I mean, the unlinking of one's conscience from the pursuit of truth is, I guess it's still mysterious for me, but it's phenomenal too, like how that can happen. Rather than to say, well, the smarter you are, the more moral you're going to be, which is maybe what I was expecting of human history, and yet are performed when there's an uncoupling of the conscience from the pursuit for truth. One of the darker sides of the Enlightenment, I think.
We have, we're getting ready to wrap up, but I want to make sure I ask you a couple more questions. But before I do, I don't know if you have any questions for us.
Yeah, I wonder how difficult it is to teach philosophy in today's day and age.
Well, in comparison to years past, where philosophers would disappeared, get imprisoned, or killed by committees, right? Much better these days. Yeah, because, right, asking those questions and trying to get at the truth sometimes seems like we're questioning people's authority or their intelligence. But I think philosophy is doing really well in comparison to years past. If you compare if you take a look at the long history, but I don't know what you think.
Well, just as we have differences of opinions about how we think the world is and what we know of the world and what we count as truth, I think as philosophers, we have many different paths that we take in order to understand what we consider to be the truth. And so I find myself practicing philosophy sometimes like in a food desert or an oasis, where a lot of my philosopher colleagues are asking questions akin to the question Kim asked, what is the objective truth of the matter, without the corresponding response that you kind of sketched out, that corresponding deeply self-reflective subjectivity. Like I think in my own personal way of practicing philosophy is we don't get at issues like truth and how do we relate to our neighbors without that kind of deeply self-examination, self-reflection, and that study of the self that should precede the kinds of engagements we do in the world, creating governments, creating scientific enterprises, getting engaged in business and this, that, and the other. So if we're going on basically flying by the seat of our pants without understanding our motivations and our past history and our prejudices and biases, I think we're going to make a lot of objective mistakes, just in setting up the world and how we run the world. That's my own thinking about that. So I think philosophy has, put itself in a kind of a problem. And in fact, a lot of my colleagues will just not even talk about religion, for instance, right? They'll say, this is just a waste of a conversation, right? They're not going to engage with you or me even, a philosopher concerned about religion and recognizing its heritage and its merits and the way religious people get involved in the world. They just dismiss it, right? So I think there's definitely problems in our profession that are really big problems. But I think Kim and I are doing pretty well, in terms of sorting out some of those issues.
I think I asked you that question without really thinking about it, but these are such deeply anti-intellectual times that I would imagine your answer to be that it's really tough to teach philosophy in today's day and age, where there's such a willful ignorance or disinterest about any truth that would signify change in my lifestyle, which there's so much emotion being expressed among the supporters or resistors to change, who deny climate change, who think their country is being taken away from them, who, that sort of anti-intellectual but highly emotional trend can be found among people of your students' age. So, yeah, I appreciate your answer. I suppose in a way that far from being an unpopular course, philosophy must also be like an oasis for those searching for the real truth and to listen to their conscience that something is wrong with all this denial and reactionary fear that we find in society at the present time.
Yeah, I think if Kim can if I can speak for the both of us, we've both had experiences we share with each other and with guests like you, dialogue partners. And philosophy can be very clarifying and very helpful. It helps us to slow down and just look at issues more carefully and slowly. And because it is difficult, right? As there are difficult religious questions having to do with, what do we believe in and what is our faith orientation? It's really difficult to sort through how do we get students to slow down and ask these difficult questions about, am I just parroting what I'm learning? Am I just imitating this drive for kind of utilitarian self-gratification, or things like that, which many of our students are, how do I get out of this class so I can get my A, so I can get my job, right? And so I can...
And make some money, yeah.
And make some money, exactly, right.
We have probably about 2 minutes, so I'm going to ask these 2 questions. The one question is, who is your favorite religious figure and why? And the other one is, having studied religion as you have, do you think it's possible for humans to live in peace?
Well, the first question is pretty easy. Pope Francis comes to mind. I think we're so blessed and fortunate to have a leader of my own church who is so open to the contributions of philosophers and science and sees the need for a holistic approach to our problems. The second question again was...
world peace.
Yeah. Do you, having studied religion as you have, do you think it's possible for humans to live in peace?
Well, that is certainly what all authentic religions and spiritual traditions offer. I think the introduction, exposure to, and support for a way of life that builds the necessary bases for lasting peace. That is to say, justice, respect for the dignity of each person, the sense of connection with each person that Buddhism promotes, and the need to practice compassion, I think, lay the bases for world peace, which otherwise would be a piece of the cemetery or something imposed on people if they weren't already involved in what it takes to enjoy a lasting peace in the world. Religions and spiritual traditions at their heart are a valuable, necessary part of establishing the basis for a lasting peace in society and in the world. And I may add, to establish a peaceful and healthy relationship with our natural home as well.
You have that last word. That was a wonderful response.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I want to keep dialoguing, but I should respect everyone's time. So thank you so much, Father Mosher, for joining us.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you so much.
I'm grateful too. I was looking forward to this conversation when I saw your questions, so it's been even more enjoyable than I'd hoped. Thank you.
Yeah.
And thank you also to our crew and to our audience. Please check out our YouTube playlist and join us next time. Thank you.
Thank you.